Subscribe for more what ifs.
Chapter 2. Sides Unseen. That first week after graduation, it seemed as if summer had come into full bloom. Kids of all ages released from the academy were free to roam the streets, and the sound of childish laughter could be heard everywhere as the sun shone down on the village and flashes against windows. Everyone seemed happy. After all, who could be gloomy on such a beautiful day? Minato, that was who. Having spent the past year longing for this summer when he could finally begin official training with the other graduates and the more seasoned nin, he was feeling pretty hard done by. This was because on a day when he should have been running around like a lunatic in one of the genin training grounds with Ai and Sabaru, enjoying the sunshine and the smell of fresh green life, he was on his way to shut himself into the village library with a girl who went everywhere with a little storm cloud over her head. He was half hoping she wouldn't even bother to show up or had forgotten their appointment. But that was hopeless. If she failed to turn up, other kids in his position might just shrug and go play outside. Minato knew he was pathetically responsible enough to track down where she lived and remind her all over again about the consequences of failing her exams twice. It was needless speculation. When he arrived at the library, she was already there waiting for him on the steps, wearing what he suspected she'd been wearing a week ago on graduation day. Had she at any point taken those clothes off and washed in the intervening time? Ready? He asked her, smiling a little fixedly. She looked at that smile in disgust and went inside ahead of him. Although he initially dreaded these lessons, as the days slid past, he grew to consider the tutoring rather less hostile than he'd initially expected. There was even something extremely cathartic about reciting information from books he knew off by heart to a catatonic nitwit who spent most of the time with her forehead pressed to the library table. So you see why lightning is greater than earth, but weaker than wind. Minato saw himself as a rather diligent teacher. It was just his pupil who was unwilling. She pulled faces, picked her nose, and was a genius at making him feel like the stupid one for having bothered to learn all this stuff in the first place. You need to get this or you won't pass, he warned her. Yes. But it was a case of leading a cat to a pond but being unable to make it swim, and if he tried to force the issue, he would find claws permanently lodged in his arms for his trouble. She was not only disinclined to learn, but vehemently opposed to it for some personal philosophical reasons. When will you ever need to know the boiling point of water when you're fighting someone? It might come up, he said quietly, though he knew that wasn't the point. A shinobi wasn't also a warrior of great skill, but a man or woman of great intellect and wisdom. Having a rounded education developed them as people, rather than as just killing machines. He'd already explained that to Kushina, but she just looked at him like he was an idiot again. Occasionally, the lessons would move outside when the subject turned to improving physical skills, and although he was cleared to use the proper training grounds. As an academy student, Kushina was still restricted to using only the academy grounds, which were typically closed off during the summer holidays. The only places they had in which to practice were the narrow, broken alleys behind houses and a few abandoned buildings in the oldest districts. They had to be careful. If the Uchiha police caught them messing around condemned houses and shops, they'd be sent home with a flea in their ear. For the most part, however, Kushina was just about as enthusiastic in practical matters as she was intellectual. He showed her all the basic jutsu she needed to know to pass the test, and when she wasn't mispronouncing their names, she was mixing up the hand seals. You're left-handed, he tried to tell her. You have to take that into account when making the seals. Everything is reversed for you. That's not how we were taught in Whirlpool, she said sullenly, continuing to hack her kunai away into the ground with her right hand. Minato didn't know what she was doing. She was supposed to be making a clone, not digging holes in alleys. Whirlpool might have had it wrong, he said tiredly. Kushina just glared at him. You only have 2 months left, he sighed. If you haven't grasped it all by then. 10. Then what? Then you'll have to repeat the year. I can only help you so much. Fat lot of help you've been then, she grumbled, and soon after they parted ways. The sun set on another long and unproductive day, and Minato spent the evening, as he did most evenings, mentally going over the lesson plan for tomorrow, wondering how he was supposed to get the importance through to her. Then he counted the food supplies in the fridge and calculated he would have to go shopping next Saturday if he and his father were going to have enough to last through the following week. He used the last of the chicken to make a supper of sweet chicken strips and rice balls and separated it onto 2 plates. On his way to eat upstairs in his room, he stopped beside the sofa in the living room where his father was stretched sideways, snoring heavily. He'd been asleep since Minato had arrived home, so he certainly hadn't eaten yet. "Dad," he called softly, placing the plate on the sofa cushion beside his father's head. "It's your dinner, Dad." Gingerly, he shook the man's shoulder and tensed up as he stirred and blinked open his bloodshot eyes. Sometimes his father really didn't like being woken up, and one had to be prepared to duck. Those puffy red eyes fixed on the plate nearby, and with a groggy croak, his father reached out to pat Minato's unkempt blonde locks. "Yeah, good boy, son," he said, though it was hard to make out. Once upstairs, changed into his pajamas and munched his rice balls contemplatively. Kushina, 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 Kushina. It was the only name that went through his head these days, and each passage was tinged with exasperation, worry, and a growing sense of nihilism. He had met the immovable object, whose existence had until recently been hypothesized only by philosophers, and he had been tasked to move her up a hill. It wasn't happening. The end of summer was approaching, the last chance to pass the exams was going to come, and at this rate Kushina was going to perform as badly as last time. He'd disappoint Jiraiya-sensei. He'd disappoint the Hokage. He'd disappoint all those strangers who gathered around, holding him to the expectations of his mother. He might have worried about disappointing his father, but as of yet the man knew nothing of his attempt to tutor the academy's dead last student. Most of all, he would have disappointed himself, because he would have failed Kushina. He owed her nothing, he thought. She was always mean and rude and standoffish, as if she resented these lessons even though no one was really forcing her to take them. But she only needed the right guidance, the right approach, the right person. He couldn't fail her. So when he went to meet her the next day at the same alleyway behind the bakery, one of the few places they had yet to be chased out of by the Uchiha police, he was a little surprised to see her performing a perfect nature manipulation jutsu. He stopped dead when he saw her, sitting with her back against the wall of the bakery, beneath one of its huge humming vents that poured the sweet, yeasty scent of fresh bread that was opposite a sagging, broken chain-link fence that backed onto someone's badly neglected garden. But little by little, the fence was breaking even more. One link snapped, then another. A third went flying off with a ping, and the fence shuddered. Kushina just sat, flicking her finger with every snap of metal. "What are you doing?" he asked. She froze, fingers suddenly clamped between her knees in a bid for innocence. The fence wobbled to a peaceful standstill, as if breathing a sigh that the abuse had stopped. "Nothing," Kushina said, eyes wide at him. "I wasn't doing nothing." That meant she was doing something, but he hadn't really managed to make her understand about double negatives yet, so he refrained from pointing it out. "Were you using jutsu?" "No," she said quickly. "Nature manipulation is just one of the fundamentals." Fundamentals? He'd only been instructed about nature manipulation a couple of years ago by his sensei, and he knew for a fact that it was advanced Chunin-level stuff that had never been taught at the academy. Minato went over to the fence and ran his finger over the cuts in the links. They were perfectly, incision-like strikes with a precision that must have taken years to master. He looked back at Kushina, who was still staring wide-eyed at him as if she was expecting him to shout at her. He'd caught her vandalizing a fence, but really that was nothing compared to this revelation. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. "This is C-class or even B-class stuff." She stared at him, nonplussed. "This is basic," she said. "No, it isn't," he cried. "I've been breaking my back to show you how to do a simple shadow clone, and you can already manipulate nature. What are you, earth, no wind? Are you wind?" "I'm wind," she said. A curious expression came over her that Minato didn't think he saw too often. She was surprised. "I'm wind, too," he cried happily. "This is perfect. I know loads of wind jutsu I can show you. But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you show that to the examiners?" A sullen scowl wrinkled her nose. What would have been the point? She stuffed her hands deeply into her pockets. "I showed the instructors what I could do when I arrived, and they told me it didn't matter. I had to relearn things the proper way, or I wouldn't become a Konoha genin. They didn't care that I was already a whirlpool genin." You what?" Minato stared at her in amazement. "You're already a ninja?" Angry, bitter tears were starting to leak down her cheeks, dripping off her nose and dotting the metal plate bearing the whirlpool insignia that was now hung around her neck these days from a frayed string. She hesitated, as if she thought she'd already said too much. Then she cried wretchedly. "Since I was 9. "So, you've already taken the T-test?" he asked doubtfully, because it seemed amazing to him that someone who had passed the genin exam 2 years ago would have such trouble with it now. "It wasn't the same," she said, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. Here you teach about deception and hiding. You're all taught the same tricks to use against each other, and how is that any help? In Whirlpool, we're taught according to our strengths. Each of us is unique, so you're taught about nature manipulation first. He guessed. Minato was impressed with the tough regimen, but he didn't think it could possibly be an effective way of teaching. Not if it produced people like Kushina, whose jutsu fundamentals were as weak as her academic knowledge. What good was it to master nature manipulation when you could barely hold a kunai? Of course, then it hit him that he'd been making an enormous oversight since these lessons had begun. He'd assumed the Whirlpool curriculum was the same as Konoha's. Not once had he entertained the thought that Kushina could have skills beyond what was taught in the academy, or that her ineptitude with all these subjects might not translate to an ineptitude of all subjects. So, what techniques do you know? He asked her. She looked at him with wide eyes, the green turquoise color all the more pronounced after her tears. He knew he was the first person to ever ask her that, and the sudden change in her was nothing short of miraculous. Her perpetual scowl melted away into bubbling excitement as she rushed to rise. I can do taijutsu, she said. Minato would beg to differ. He'd been showing her taijutsu stances and techniques for 3 weeks, and she'd yet to demonstrate even a correct ready stance. Okay, he said, willing to humor her. He was desperate for anything at this point. She assumed a stance, but it wasn't like any he'd seen in the academy curriculum, where students were taught to brace their feet apart and draw their hands into loose fists. Kushina's pose, by contrast, was very feminine. There was no other word for it, and it looked so odd on a girl who strove to otherwise avoid reminding anyone of her femininity. She held one hand up above her head and one out before her, and balanced on one foot. She was as poised as a heron before a strike. After a moment, she executed a series of moves against an invisible opponent, and Minato noted that she fought low to ground and mostly used kicks instead of punches, utilizing her greater lower body strength. But overall, there were a lot of unnecessary flourishes and turns, as if she was dancing instead of fighting, and although it was unexpected enough to take a few enemies by surprise, she was expending way more energy than necessary. When she finished the kata, he asked, "Why didn't you show that to the instructors?" "I did," she repeated with exasperated patience. "They said it wasn't to standard. I would have to relearn it all your way." And by your way, she meant Konoha's way, a way she had no doubt scorned from the very beginning. It was clear that if she couldn't do taijutsu her way, she wouldn't do it at all. How maddening. When you retake your exams, you should definitely do it your way, however you like, he told her. But you can probably improve it. You're using a lot of energy. I know. My instructors told me I had much higher energy and chakra levels than anyone else in the academy, so they taught me this particular style. It was best suited for me. It's very pretty, but it's not totally practical. It's fine for me, she said loudly. Okay, he replied meekly, not wanting to argue over it. He was just relieved that she knew more taijutsu than he originally could have hoped. What about ninjutsu? She formed a few seals and slashed her palm at the alley wall beside them. A large gash in the brickwork appeared. The first thing we're taught in Waterfall is our elemental affinity, and everything we learn is based on that. Swapping logs around and making clones that any half-wit can see through is for babies. That's not ninjutsu. She showed him more. A technique for blowing high-velocity winds from her mouth that could potentially blow opponents away if she could somehow make it a little stronger, and another that drew them in. She could create, out of nothing, a smokescreen to hide herself, and even showed him she could create a miniature hurricane in the alley, and swore she could make one 10 times bigger if they had the space. And given her boast about possessing an abnormally high level of chakra, he was prepared to believe her. This is great, he said to her. Since I've got a wind affinity too, I can show you even more. Advanced stuff like how to make wind clones. I swear, if you can pull off a wind clone in the exam, you'll have the examiners eating out of your hand. You'll be a genin in no time. I already told you, she huffed. I am a genin, yes, but now you'll be a Konoha genin. I suppose that's the only kind of genin that counts, huh? She sneered sarcastically. Well, he began slowly. Whirlpool doesn't exist anymore, so if you want to become a chunin, you have to go through Konoha's system from the beginning too. Whirlpool still exists. She broke in, outraged. He shrugged, bemused by her sudden anger. No, it doesn't. You've heard the news the same as anyone else. There's nothing left over there. The village was torn down and everyone who remained there was slaughtered. The only part of Whirlpool that's left is you and the other survivors, and they're happy to be part of Konoha, so why aren't you? Hot tears stood out in her eyes. You're a pig, she raged. A horrible, horrible beast. Forget these lessons, I don't want to see you again. I don't want to be part of Konoha if it's full of people like you. But leave me alone. She turned and ran away down the alley, disappearing into the bright sunshine of the street beyond. Minato stood, stumped and dismayed, but steadily growing irritated. Typical, he thought. Just as she was showing promise beneath this well-preserved front of the village idiot, she had to blow another fuse and retreat on all the progress they'd made. Girls. They were such an overly emotional waste of time. At least he figured he knew at least one person who would sympathize. And then she just ran off, shouting that she never wanted to see me again. Sensei, I don't think I can teach her anything. She doesn't want to be a part of Konoha. All I did was tell her the truth and she just blew up. His sensei wasn't really attending. They were both crouched behind the chimney pots of a civilian house, and though Minato had nothing better to do than pick at the lichen on the roof tiles, Jiraiya was peering around the corner with a small handheld periscope. The women's bathhouse was just a few hundred meters away on the other side of the roof. I don't know what to do. Should I go after her? Minato asked. Oh, yes. Shh. Never give up on a lady, Minato. Half the thrill is in the chase. Oh, that's right, madam. Stretch up those arms nice and high. Jiraiya chuckled, jotting something down in his notebook. I'm not seeing where the thrill is here, Minato said slowly. I can't say anything to her without getting my head bitten off. Probably because you're not being very sensitive. What? After a moment, Jiraiya took his eye away from the periscope and returned to lean back against the chimney beside him. His wooden Geta shoes clacked against the terracotta tiles beneath them. What was it you said to her again? Just that she doesn't have a village left anymore. Ah, yes, and that all the people who didn't get out were slaughtered, his teacher repeated, which almost certainly included her parents. Right? She was an orphan when she arrived, wasn't she? Yes, but Minato hedged, feeling cold and clumsy all of a sudden. I was only trying to tell her that she can't keep scorning this village forever. It's the only home she's got now. Also very true, Jiraiya agreed. But try to make her see that fact without mentioning slaughter or making it sound like she has to sacrifice her whirlpool identity. Imagine if Konoha was invaded and destroyed tomorrow and you got out, but I, your beloved sensei, didn't. Wouldn't it horrify you for someone to speak so flippantly of my death and demand you give up all hope and attachment to Konoha? Minato thought for a moment. You'd never die. Humor me. I guess. I was a little insensitive, he sighed, slowly resolving himself to finding her and apologizing. He didn't know what he'd do if Konoha up and disappeared tomorrow, and though he didn't really understand what it was like to lose parents since his father was still lingering on bitterly, and he didn't really remember his mother, the thought of losing his sensei was painful. It couldn't have been easy for Kushina to lose everything. Even if he thought she had chosen a very unnecessarily negative way of dealing with her predicament, he knew he had to go easy on her. Jiraiya was laughing again. See, girls aren't so hard to understand. I thought you said they exist to confuse us. They do, but when you're as, experienced as me with the fairer sex, you learn how their minds work, and you're learning from a master. You'll be a regular little ladies' man soon enough. Why would I want to be a lady mamon? Minato asked tiredly. No, a ladies' man, Minato. And that's why, his sensei said, suddenly seizing him by the shoulders and pulling him up to point over the chimney. Behold, perfection. He said it so loudly all 20 heads of the naked women bathers turned in their direction with a mixture of surprise, horror, and rage. Mostly rage. After a few startled seconds of silence, during which Minato could have sworn his nose started to run, the women began shouting obscenities and grabbing everything close to hand to throw at them. Some of them were ninja, and their aims were deadly accurate. All of a sudden, student and teacher were slipping and sliding away down the roof tiles while a hail of soap, rocks, and buckets rained down around them. Minato landed first on the street and flung himself back to take shelter in a doorway. Laughing, Jiraiya landed after him and grinned. Oh hey, did you get hit? Sorry about that, I thought you knew when to duck by now. Minato wiped the stream of blood under his nose, pretty sure he hadn't been hit at all. I need to go find Kukushina. Best of luck, my boy. Remember what your master said and she'll be putty in your hands. But not for the first time Minato had the muteness that if his sensei knew half as much about women as he claimed, they wouldn't always be throwing stuff at him. Rubbing his nose on his sleeve, he ran away through the streets, intending to find Kushina and put things to right. The fact that he didn't know where she lived wasn't a problem. Like the other orphan refugees from Whirlpool, she would have been housed with a social service center when she arrived. Although it was doubtful she was still staying there, they would at least know where she had been placed. The center was a little rundown, fronted by a yard that was filled mostly with gravel and broken toys that were bleached with years of outdoor use. As always, the door was wide open for lack of air conditioning, and a smell wafted through it like something pretty unpalatable was being cooked inside. Minato went right inside, passing through narrow, badly lit corridors with damp, peeling walls that probably hadn't been painted for 50 years. He nearly jumped when a young woman opened the door he was passing. She jumped a little too, and stared at him through her spectacles. "Ah, are you one of the new boys?" she asked uncertainly, clearly trying to remember if she should know him. "No, I'm just looking for someone," he said. "There's this girl called Kushina." "Oh, her." He'd been fully prepared to launch into a detailed description of what she looked like and where she came from and why he wanted to know where she'd been placed, but apparently the woman knew exactly who he meant and just jerked her hand at him, hinting he should follow her. He did, and as they headed deeper into the center, he began to hear the sound of laughing and shouting children, and that awful smell got stronger. It smelled like burning beans. The woman pushed through a set of swinging doors and held it open for him, and Minato found himself stepping into an extremely noisy dining hall. He hadn't realized there were so many homeless, orphaned children in Konoha, but from the snippets of voices he could make out, most appeared to have a Whirlpool accent. They were refugees. "She's over there," said the woman, pointing to one of the emptiest tables where a lone figure sat stirring a spoon around her bowl. Minato looked over the same time she looked up, and Kushina stiffened to see him. It was hard to say who was more surprised. Minato hadn't actually thought she'd still be in the social services center after her arrival almost 2 years ago. Suddenly, Kushina stood up from the table, grabbed her bowl, and disappeared through a set of doors on the other side of the hall. "She's in a funny mood today," she warned. "And considering it's Kushina, that's saying something. Are you a friend from school?" "No," Minato said automatically, because never once had he considered their antagonistic relationship even close to resembling the kind of friendship he had with others. And then he felt a little bad, because he knew that he was probably the closest thing to a friend in Kushina's eyes. "Actually," he added, "yes, I suppose I am." "Well, if you can cheer her up, that would be great," she said, and told him how to get to the dormitory where Kushina had probably gone. She couldn't take him there since she'd spotted a fight breaking out between 2 Whirlpool boys and had to rush over to break it up before everyone got splattered with bean stew. Minato left the dining hall and followed the woman's directions. Sure enough, after going up 1 flight of stairs, he came to a large room lined with almost 30 wire-framed beds. And in the middle of one of the beds, he found someone sitting with a white sheet pulled up over her head, finishing her dinner. She ignored him as he entered, pretending that if she couldn't see him, then he couldn't possibly see her either. Gingerly, he sat down on the bed beside hers and felt the springs creak and sag beneath him. "I wouldn't sit on Tori's bed if I were you," she said from beneath her sheet. "He's a bedwetter." Minato stood quickly. "And don't even think of sitting on my bed," she warned. He hadn't been planning on it. "Is this where you live?" he said, probably a little unwisely, because Kushina's spoon clacked loudly against her bowl like she thinking about throwing them at him. "Sorry we can't all live in palaces like you," she snapped. She'd clearly never seen his house, but although he'd never thought of his house as a den of luxury, he was beginning to think maybe it was compared to living in this place. And at least he had a chest full of toys and a wardrobe full of clothes, a window of his own, and a soft bed. All Kushina had was a cardboard box under her cot with her name on the side, filled with 1 teddy, a couple of mismatched coloring pens, and a thin stack of playing cards. "Well," he began, dragging his gaze away from her meager possessions, I didn't think you lived at the sea center. I told you I didn't have a home. Aren't they supposed to find you one? What do you want? Did you just come round to laugh at me because I live here because you didn't laugh it up enough that my village was destroyed?" "I never laughed," he denied, fidgeting awkwardly. "I came to say I'm sorry." She cussed at him using words he'd never heard anyone but his sensei use when he was drunk and crashing into things. The bowl of bean stew dropped on the floor and Kushina hurled herself sideways down on the bed, the sheet floating down on top of her like a death shroud. Minato looked uncertainly at the lumpy shape she presented, wondering if she was even open to apologies at this point. "I don't think I was very kind," he went on carefully. "I didn't mean it like I said it, though. I was just trying to say that, for no, at least, what's left of Whirlpool exists in Konoha. Maybe one day they'll rebuild it, but for now, can't you accept that this is your home? And if you want to help rebuild Whirlpool again, then you're going to have to become a great ninja, and that's what I'm trying to help you achieve." I'm not trying to make you into a Konoha citizen. I just want you to be able to grow, and then you can be whatever you want to be. The lump beneath the sheet was silent. He wasn't even sure she was breathing. Right? He asked. Kushina, please let me continue tutoring you. And if you really hate me, then you won't ever have to see me again once you pass. You're an idiot, she said quietly. You have friends, don't you? That awful skinny girl and that quiet fat boy. I've seen you laughing and playing baseball with that guy who punches me, and those girls who pulled my hair. Everyone likes you, and you're graduated so you could be out taking missions with your team. You could be doing anything you want right now, and I know you hate having to be with me, so why are you bothering? I'm telling you to go away, so just go. I don't hate being with you, he said quickly, because it wasn't true at all. She was tedious and frustrating and hard to talk to, but he didn't hate being around her. You're a liar too. A sudden heat flashed through him like an electric shock, making his head feel unpleasant and tingly. Well, he exploded, struggling to articulate his anger. You're not even nice. I've tried so many times to be friends with you, but you're always so rude no matter what I do. He subsided as soon as he said it. He hated getting angry, and he could count the number of times he'd shouted at someone on his left hand. Anger always made him feel sick and tongue-tied, and now he was shaking. So was Kushina. She'd curled into a tighter lump beneath the covers, and he could hear her making gasping little breathy sounds that made him feel even worse. I know I'm not. I can't help it. I'm sorry I can't be like you, who's so nice, even the horrible people are nice back. Now he was sorry he'd ever mentioned it. It's not your fault. Yes, it is. I used to be like those other girls before, and 10. I realized it was so pointless. I used to have so many friends, but now I can't even keep one. And I don't want friends. I don't even want to be a great ninja. I just want my mom. She dissolved into sobs, clutching the sheets hard around her head as her body shook. Why did they take her? She cried, her voice strained and breaking. She wasn't fighting them. They didn't need to hurt her. Now I'll never see her again. It's not fair. It's not fair. It's not fair. She started to scream. Minato took a step away from the bed, alarmed. Was he supposed to comfort her, shout for help? He tried placing a hand on her back, but she savagely jerked, trying to shake him off, inconsolable with grief and anger. I lost my mom too, he told her, over her sobs. I know what it's like. Kushina surged upright, the sheet flying away to reveal her red, tear-stained face. Did you watch her get dragged away by a gang of reformers? Did you have to crawl through a pit of dead bodies for 2 days until you found her again? And no, he stammered. She died when I was born. Then you know nothing, she screamed at him. If you have nothing, you don't know what it's like to lose it. He couldn't think of what to say to this. Only he thought she was probably right. He supposed it was worse to know and love a mother and lose her violently than to not even remember her enough to miss her. That's why I want nothing. I don't want new parents. I don't want a new home. I don't want a new village. And I don't want new friends. I want nothing. Then nothing can be taken away again. But what's the point in living if you don't have anything to loathe? He asked. She glowered at him. You're right, I don't know what it's like for you. You've probably had it harder than most of us in Konoha can understand, but I want to understand. I don't think it's right for anyone to be alone. What do you know? She said scornfully, throwing herself down to press her face into his pillow. I know what it's like to be alone, he said. She scoffed, voice muffled. You have a million friends. They like me because I'm a genius, that's all. If I wasn't, they'd have nothing to do with me. I don't know any of them that well, and I definitely never invite them over to my house. My sensei is the only person I can really talk to, but he's one of the jonin, so he's always busy. He leaves the village for weeks and months sometimes. I know what it's like to hurt and have no one to turn to. So? She said sullenly. So I don't know. He sighed. He'd argued and defended his point, but he didn't know what it was anymore. He was just glad she'd stopped crying. I don't really remember my mom, but I still like to think that she's still here watching me. Don't be stupid, she grumbled. Only babies believe in ghosts. No, I don't think she's a ghost. I don't even think she's really watching me at all, but I pretend that she is. I do everything the best I can because I want to do the things that would make her happy and proud of me if she was still here. So even if she's gone for good, I still kind of owe it to her to be the kind of person she probably wanted me to be. Kushina sniffed but said nothing. What do you suppose your mother would think if she could see you now? She pounced back up to give him a shocking shove that sent him reeling back onto the bedwetter's mattress. He sincerely hoped they'd changed the sheets that morning already. Don't, she snarled. Pretend you know my mother, If she was looking down on me, she'd want me to be sad. Because she's dead, everyone wants people to be sad when they die. What, forever? Minato asked, picking himself up. She looked uncertain. Obviously not, but she ran out of words. He tilted his head on one side and watched her curiously fight her mixed feelings. Perhaps he'd gotten through to her. Perhaps he hadn't. All he knew was that he'd done all he could. Well, if you want to become a great kunoichi and give her something interesting to watch, I'll be waiting by the river near the gazebo tomorrow, SME time as usual. He waited for her to say something, but when all she did was glare glumly at the floor, he parted with another sigh and left. And for once, instead of going to hang around the park with the other boys, or to the ice cream shop owned by Aya's mother, who was 10 times kinder than her daughter and never failed to give Minato free samples of the latest flavors, he headed home. His father was out at work and the house seemed even quieter and more gloomy than it usually did. But for once, Minato looked at it and appreciated that he didn't have to share a room with 30 other kids in various bedwetters. And when he set off the next morning for the river, he was once again unsure of what he'd find when he got there. The gazebo stood on a small artificial island in the middle of the river, and that was where Minato waited, shoes beside him and feet dangling in the water. The usual time he met Kushina was around 9 o'clock, but the hour slipped by as uneventfully as the leaves floating past on the river's current. Minato began to grow bored. It was looking more and more likely that he'd failed to convince Kushina after all, and he'd have to go tell his sensei and probably the Hokage too, who'd probably reevaluate any previous thought he might have had that Minato was fit to be his successor. And then Minato wondered if he cared. Being Hokage was Jiraiya sensei's idea, not his own, as he was only currently concerned with becoming a ninja. And this thing called puberty that people kept warning him would be coming soon and would do horrible, horrible things to his body. Picking up his shoes, he stepped out onto the water, using chakra to walk on the slippery, moving surface. He couldn't wait here all day. He was going to find his team and join their training. He knew that he should have been relieved. Rid of Kushina, he was free to pursue his own interests again. But he didn't feel relieved. He didn't even feel happy. He felt only that he'd let someone down who possibly, or all the people he knew, needed help the most. Can you teach me to do that? He turned sharply to the bank where a scruffy-haired redhead sat, arms around her knees. Oh, was all he could think to say. I didn't think you'd come. She shrugged and looked away from him like it was no big deal, but he realized that to both of them it was. Sure, I can teach you, he said, smiling. It's easy once you know how. The remaining weeks of the summer passed a little more quickly than he anticipated, until there was only a week left until Kushina had to go to the academy to retake her tests. He remained a little worried about her lack of basic jutsu, but he had to remind himself that compared to the beginning of the summer, she had improved a hell of a lot, even if the biggest change had only been in her attitude. As long as he'd been sure to incorporate her elemental affinity into her techniques, she was willing to learn them. Even if it was absurd that this meant she picked up something so advanced and specialized as creating wind clones before she'd mastered a simple henge jutsu. Minato had no idea what this meant for her exams, but most of all, he was just glad that she appeared to enjoy their sessions a little more, and even he was finding it more challenging than he'd anticipated. What with having to invent brand new wind-based jutsu just to satisfy Kushina's picky requirements. Half the lessons together consisted of Minato himself trying to figure out how to enhance a kawarimi jutsu with the wind element before Kushina would deign to learn it. And she laughed very quickly at his expense whenever he failed. He didn't mind so much. It was probably the only time she smiled. He even started taking some of Jiraiya's advice as a sensei and tried to find ways of rewarding his temperamental student whenever she succeeded. Positive reinforcement, his sensei said, was the path to a happy student who was eager to please. Kushina, on the other hand, always found his attempts to reward her highly suspect. "Why you buy me ice cream?" she said, frowning at the banana split that Ai's mother had placed on the bar before her. "Because we made good progress today and I really fancy ice cream," he said. He didn't want to explicitly say he was rewarding her. Knowing Kushina, she'd take that as patronizing and more evidence of his superiority complex over her, and with just a week left until the exams, he couldn't afford her taking off in another huff. But he also got the feeling that Kushina didn't actually like ice cream that much. So the next day when she pulled off a near-flawless taijutsu kata with far fewer useless flourishes than usual, he asked her, "Are you hungry? Where'd you like to eat?" She just stared at him blankly for a moment. as if scrutinizing the question for criticism or ulterior motives. Then she said, "I like ramen. Ichiraku do nice ramen," he said. "Let's go there." In truth, Minato didn't really like ramen at all. It was watery and bland, and he always felt a little sick after a bowl of the stuff, but it was worth it to see Kushina sitting beside him, guzzling down mouthful after mouthful with a pink glow of happiness about her cheeks. And as he was looking at her, he noticed something. "What happened to your hitayate?" he asked. For as long as he'd known her, she'd always worn it, even when the ribbon was down to its last shreds. Kushina reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled it out to show him, though now it was nothing more than a metal plate with the whirlpool symbol engraved on it. The ribbon had deteriorated completely, and even the plate itself was so scratched it no longer shone, and rust was beginning to set in around the edges. "Don't get too happy," she told him. "Just because I'm willing to take the Konoha exams doesn't mean I'm going to give this thing up. Why don't you get a new one engraved?" he asked. "It looks like it's on its last legs." She slipped it back into his pocket. "It was my mother's." "Oh, it was a present?" "No," she said simply, looking sourly at her noodles, joy gone from her cheeks. "I lost mine when I escaped the house, so when I went to the grave, she'd taken it off her mother's body." Minato began to wonder if he had a problem. His foot would keep finding its way into his mouth. It was so difficult to get Kushina to smile, and it only took one misguided question to turn her back into a sharp little stone. He wanted to make it up to her, and he was beginning to get an idea of how. Another issue that seemed to bother her was the fact that he was the one who always paid for the ice cream or the ramen. It wasn't like he had a lot of money to throw around, but he knew Kushina didn't have any at all. He didn't want to draw attention to the fact, but every time it came to paying the bill, it was a forcible reminder of just how different their circumstances were. That would all change once she passed her exams. He wondered if she was a little nervous, or even keen to pass. It was hard to tell with Kushina. He only noticed in those last couple of days before the day of the exam, she seemed to be concentrating twice as hard and listening as if she cared about his advice. On the evening before the exams, they went through a mock trial of all the things she'd be expected to perform. Her henge could have been better, but surely the fact that she could slice open a wall would be taken into consideration when marking her. "I think you'll pass," he said, because although he wasn't sure, he knew often the greatest asset of all was confidence, even if it was false. "You've really nailed some of these techniques." "I guess," she said, sitting down against the wall and stirring up a lot of dust in this abandoned shop they'd commandeered for practice. She was out of breath and flushed, and quite obviously tired. Although Minato had been putting in just as much effort, he remained standing, not a hair out of place. This, however, wasn't a bad sign for her chances tomorrow, as a benchmark Namikaze Minato set the standard pretty high. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "Maybe," she said elusively, and her caginess meant she probably was a little bit. As difficult as Kushina could be, he'd never seen her this tense. Suddenly she stopped breathing, her hand in her pocket. He cocked his head at her. "What is it?" "My tie," she said, patting down her jacket frantically. "It's gone." She stood abruptly, forgetting her fatigue in an instant to smash her palms against every pocket in her clothing. When this yielded nothing, she began to turn on the spot, head darting from side to side as she looked about. "I must have dropped it while we were. Where's it gone? I have to find it. Where is he?" "It's okay, don't worry." "I'm sure it'll turn up," he told her. "No, I have to find it." They looked all over the old shop, in every room they'd practiced in, and even a few they hadn't. There were a lot of old boxes and other junk piled up against the walls, and plenty of nooks and crannies for a metal plate to have fallen into and gotten lost. But though they searched for over 30 minutes, they found nothing. Kushina was very upset. Minato looked at her and wondered if she was about to cry. "Maybe you left it at the center?" he suggested. "No, I had it when we arrived here," she said angrily. "It has to be here." "But the light's going," he pointed out, and with the windows half boarded up, the late evening light was fading twice as fast inside the abandoned shop. "We'll look tomorrow. My test is tomorrow. Then we'll look after the test. You'll get it back, Kushina, I promise." She swallowed hard and blinked rapidly. Then she nodded grudgingly. She was willing to believe him for now, though it was difficult to convince her to go home and get some rest in preparation for tomorrow. She wanted to come back with a torch and search all night if she had to. And maybe that was what she did, because when he greeted her the next morning outside the gates of the academy, she looked red around the eyes and pale around the lips. "You don't look very fresh," he remarked to her. "Neither do you," she accused. He shifted uncomfortably. "I was busy last night," was all he could tell her. The examiners arrived. Jiraiya arrived too, for this was also a test of Minato's skills as a teacher. And then shortly after that, even the Hokage appeared with his ever-present entourage. With every new arrival, Kushina grew paler and paler. It seemed that, to her, it was a relief when the examiners beckoned for her to follow them into the academy. Everyone else waited outside. Minato, a little shy of the Hokage, made sure to stand where Jiraiya was between them, but that didn't seem to help. "Do you feel she's improved under your tutelage, my boy?" The Sandaime asked him, leaning down to address him. "Maybe, a little, I hope." He wasn't really sure what to say. He hated when he sounded like was boasting, and though he preferred not to make any hasty exaggerations of Kushina's improvement, he couldn't deny that she had improved a lot. Was it fair to take credit for that? Everyone thought Kushina was stupid, and Kushina had been too proud to condescend to Konoha ways and prove otherwise. But almost everything she was now going to show those examiners were things she'd already known. All Minato had done was try to show her that she could keep the way she'd learned in Whirlpool and try to mix it with the things they taught her in Konoha. It hadn't taken much talent on his behalf. It had simply been the case that after a while, Kushina had been willing to listen to him in a way she'd never listened to the instructors. So perhaps Jiraiya was right. As paltry as Kushina's attempts at friendliness were, it was possibly the case that she liked Minato more than anyone else in the village. He waited anxiously, biting his lip and listening to the adults talking idly between themselves. How was Kushina doing in there, he wondered. Had they asked her to perform a henge yet? If they had she gotten the face right? Faces were always her weakest point. Only 15 minutes later, Kushina emerged from the academy with the instructors. He searched her face as she approached for any sign of joy or sadness that might indicate if she'd passed or not, but her face was carefully neutral. She stopped a few feet from him, looking back at his expression stolidly. "Well?" he asked, looking from her to the examiners for a clue. Kushina turned slightly and pointed to the black band tied around her upper arm. The symbol of the leaf glinted on the metal plate sewn into it. "You did it," he cried, grinning broadly, and she smiled faintly in return. "Well done, I knew you could do it," Jiraiya said, though it was Minato's shoulder he clapped, and Minato he smiled at. "Congratulations, my girl," the Hokage said after a brief word with the examiners. "They tell me you passed with flying colors. Above average, I dare say. Minato, that's quite an achievement, but you better be careful. If you get too good at this, we'll be asking you to tutor the rest of your summers away." His entourage was smiling too and trading knowing looks with one another. They murmured their own praises and commented once more that they would continue to be interested in his progress. Hands patted his head and his shoulders. Someone shook his hand. He blushed and bore it, and when his eyes found Kushina again, she seemed to be standing so far away and no longer smiling. No one was patting her on the head or taking her by the hand. Unnoticed by everyone else, she was beginning to turn, about to walk away. Minato slid away from the adults who were now talking amongst themselves and jogged to intercept her. "Congratulations," he said. "You did it all yourself, whatever they think." "Whatever," she said, as if she didn't care what anyone thought. Although from the way her eyes were a little bright, he doubted this attitude was an honest one. "I got you a present," he said, reaching into his pouch to show her what he'd been working on last night. Her mouth dropped open, and she stilled when she saw it. My Heitai 8, she whispered, but unlike before, it had been relaid upon a new pristine white strip and its dull scratched-up surface had been oiled and cleaned of rust. Kushina's hand hovered above it, as if she was afraid to take it. Then suddenly her jaw clenched, and that hand curled into a fist. The next thing he knew, she'd thumped him in the stomach the exact same way she had when they'd first met. Her punches were as hard as ever. Winded, he dropped to the ground. The adult stopped talking and looked over. "You beast!" she cried, furious tears running down her face. "You took it from me? I was worried sick. I searched all night. I thought I'd lost it forever. You. She took a deep, shaking breath. "You even got the rust off." "I have fixed it for you," he rasped, pushing himself gingerly to his feet again. "So now you can wear both. Konoha and Whirlpool, together, right?" Big wet eyes widened on him. "Here." He reached out, pressing the plate over her forehead and reaching over her shoulders to tie the ribbon into a secure knot behind her head. The white ribbon suited her. Her scruffy red bangs seemed all the more vibrant next to it. When he stepped back, he prepared for another punch. As she'd done the first time he'd put her Heitai 8 back on after the academy bullies had thrown it up on the bakery roof. But this time her face had crumpled slightly with tears she was determined to hold back. "Thank you," she said, though she whispered it so quietly he hardly heard her. Then very suddenly she threw herself at him. For a split second he thought he was under attack, until he realized she was only hugging him. A lot of girls did that to him, but for Kushina to do it was a shock to still most beating hearts. He took a sharp breath and inhaled a mouthful of red hair. She drew back quickly. "Sorry," she said, red-faced and touching the hair he'd almost choked on. "I need to cut it." "No, it's okay," he said, still getting over the shock of being embraced and trying to ignore how his sensei was leering at him, eyebrows waggling. "I like it long." And little did he know that from that day forward, Uzumaki Kushina vowed never to cut her hair again. To be continued.